Tiny kingdoms versus massive empires, the ultimate showdown. Welcome to Legends Untold. Subscribe and share. In 1427, imagine this: a peasant army from a country roughly the size of Virginia managed to lure 500,000 Ming soldiers, yes, 500,000, into a foggy mountain pass. And then, in a single afternoon, they simply wiped them out. Blip. Gone. Think about that for a second. The Ming Empire wasn't just big, it was a global superpower, a colossus of its age, ruling over 1/5 of all humanity. Dai Viet, on the other hand? Its entire population wouldn't even fill Beijing's suburbs today. It was, by all accounts, a fly against an elephant. So, how on earth did these little guys pull off such an impossible feat? And more importantly, why does this same underdog playbook keep beating superpowers, not just once, but again and again throughout history? It's a question that challenges everything we think we know about power. Section 1. The Ming elephant meets the Vietnamese mouse. The Ming Emperor, a man of immense ambition, had spent decades meticulously forging China into a 15 million square kilometer war machine. His empire was a marvel of organization and might, capable of projecting power across vast distances. So, when the Vietnamese throne showed even a hint of instability, he didn't hesitate. He marched in with a formidable force of 200,000 seasoned veterans. Then, just 2 years later, he doubled that number, sending in another 200,000. It was an overwhelming display of force designed to crush any resistance before it could even properly form. Contrast that with Dai Viet. Their court could barely muster maybe 30,000 full-time troops, and let's be honest, most of those were farmers who drilled on weekends, armed with little more than local knowledge and fierce determination. On paper, the contest wasn't just uneven, it was laughable. It was Goliath against an ant. But here's where the story gets interesting. The Vietnamese commander, a brilliant strategist named Le Loi, understood something fundamental about power dynamics. Size can be a weakness, and terrain, a silent, deadly ally. He immediately did two things that fundamentally changed the math overnight, turning the tide with audacious simplicity. First, he emptied every granary and village along the Chinese line of march. This wasn't just about denying food, it was about psychological warfare. It forced a massive, well-fed army to forage in unfamiliar, hostile territory, slowly but surely eroding their morale, discipline, and, critically, their speed. Imagine 500,000 men, accustomed to abundant supplies, now scrounging for food in a land that actively resisted them. Their logistics, the very lifeblood of any large army, began to fray. Second, Le Loi turned geography itself into a weapon. Vietnam's landscape of narrow passes, flooded rice paddies, and dense jungle trails wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a strategic masterpiece waiting to be exploited. This terrain utterly nullified the Ming's numerical superiority, forcing them to split their vast columns into bite-sized, vulnerable chunks. Their grand, sweeping formations were useless here. The climax of this brilliant strategy came at the Lung River, specifically at the Chi Lang Pass. Picture this: 500,000 soldiers, tired, hungry, their morale chipped away, marching blindly into a mist-shrouded valley, thinking they're finally closing in. They had no idea that for 3 days, thousands of Vietnamese soldiers, and even their massive war elephants, had waited in absolute, chilling silence, perfectly camouflaged amidst the dense foliage, ready to spring the trap. The air must have crackled with unspoken tension. When the Ming finally forded the river, they walked straight into a funnel of hidden archers and those terrifying, silent elephants. The Ming general was killed, half their precious supplies were torched, and the empire's aura of invincibility shattered so badly that Beijing signed a withdrawal treaty within the year. It was a stunning defeat. Size meant absolutely nothing when every single mile of terrain belonged to the underdog, who had patiently planned their moment to strike. Section 2. Rome's flexible legion versus the phalanx juggernaut. Fast forward 15 centuries, and we find ourselves on a dusty plain in Greece. The Roman Republic, at this point, was still a middling regional power, a rising star but not yet the undisputed behemoth it would become. They were about to collide with the formidable army of King Philip V of Macedon. Philip's men fought in the classic phalanx formation, 16,000 locked shields, bristling with 20-foot spears. This wasn't just a formation, it was a legend, an unyielding wall of bronze and steel, perfected by Alexander the Great himself. For centuries, it had been the ultimate military machine, seemingly invincible, capable of flattening even the mighty Persian Empire. The Romans, however, weren't about brute force, they were about adaptability and precision. Their legions were built on a radically different system, maniples. These were smaller, independent blocks of 120 men who could peel apart, rush through gaps in the enemy line, and reform with an almost liquid grace. It was a fluid, responsive fighting force, completely alien to the rigid, monolithic phalanx. The stage for their showdown was set at the Battle of Cynocephaly. A thick fog, as if the gods themselves were playing tricks, descended upon the battlefield, splitting both armies in half, creating a swirling, disorienting mess. In the confusion, Philip's right flank, with its fearsome phalanx, managed to crush the Roman left. Victory seemed within Macedon's grasp. But on the opposite slope, in the heart of the chaos, a moment of pure tactical brilliance unfolded. A single Roman tribune, a nameless hero of history, saw it, a tiny, fleeting gap, a vulnerability in the Macedonian line that no one else had noticed. He didn't hesitate. He wheeled 20 of his maniples, not to reinforce his struggling comrades, but to strike, hitting the Macedonian phalanx where it was weakest, its exposed flank and rear. In a matter of minutes, the supposedly unbeatable wall of spears, designed only to advance forward, became a helpless traffic jam of men who couldn't turn around, couldn't adapt, couldn't even defend themselves from an attack they weren't designed to face. Macedonia lost 8,000 veterans in an afternoon, a devastating blow, and Rome quite literally walked off with the royal treasury. Same troop ratio, a radically different outcome. This was irrefutable proof that drill, discipline, and above all, adaptability, can topple sheer mass and a reputation for invincibility. It was a lesson Rome would carry forward, shaping its military dominance for centuries to come. Section 3, Switzerland's mountain loophole. Now, let's travel to medieval Europe, to a place where tiny doesn't even begin to cover it, Switzerland. We're talking about 8 forest cantons, half of them snowed in for half the year, with fewer people than modern-day Kansas City. Yet, these fiercely independent communities dared to defy the might of the Habsburgs, the rulers of the Holy Roman Empire, a sprawling entity that considered itself the rightful heir to Rome's glory. The Habsburgs, with their vast armies and imperial ambitions, likely saw these upstart cantons as nothing more than a minor annoyance, a few stubborn peasants to be swiftly put in their place by their gleaming, heavily armored knights. But the Swiss had something the Habsburgs didn't, an intimate knowledge of their brutal, beautiful landscape, and a willingness to fight for their freedom with every fiber of their being. At Morgarten in 1315, the Swiss didn't just fight, they ambushed. They used their treacherous alpine meadows and narrow passes as their deadliest weapon. Imagine the scene, armored knights, struggling through a narrow, muddy trail, their horses slipping, their heavy armor a burden rather than protection. They were a parade, not a fighting force. And then, without warning, boulders and tree trunks rained down from above, blocking their retreat, turning the path into a deadly gauntlet. The Swiss, agile and unburdened, then descended from the slopes with their terrifying halberds, those ingenious axe-on-a-stick weapons, hacking at the trapped, disoriented Austrian nobles. The Habsburgs had cavalry, crossbows, and 10 times the tax base. The Swiss had mud, cliffs, sheer audacity, and the willingness to fight barefoot in November. The victory was so psychologically crushing, so utterly humiliating for the mighty empire, that no imperial army dared to enter the Central Alps for the next 2 centuries. The Swiss Confederation, emboldened and secure in its mountain strongholds, kept expanding city by city, canton by canton, until it became Europe's enduring symbol of neutrality and, eventually, its bank vault. Sometimes, it turns out, geography combined with an unshakable stubbornness isn't just about survival, it equals sovereignty. Section 4. What links the David's three continents, three wildly different eras, but the same powerful pattern repeats itself. It's not just a coincidence, it's a blueprint for asymmetrical warfare, a consistent narrative of the underdog triumphing against seemingly impossible odds. First, the giant always assumes the fight will be easy. This isn't just arrogance, it's a fundamental flaw in imperial thinking. Empires, by their very nature, are built on projecting power and expecting compliance. This leads to overconfidence, underestimation of the opponent, and crucially, sloppy logistics. They become convinced their size alone guarantees victory, leading to complacency in planning and execution. Why bother with meticulous planning when you can simply overwhelm? This hubris often proves to be their Achilles heel. Second, the underdog chooses where the fight happens. They don't meet the giant on its terms, in open fields where numbers truly count. Instead, they lure the behemoth into terrain that neutralizes its advantages, mountain choke points, flooded fields, dense jungles, or broken, unpredictable landscapes. These aren't just obstacles, they're equalizers. They force the giant to break down its overwhelming force into manageable, vulnerable chunks, making a 1,000,000-man army fight like a 1,000-man skirmish. The terrain becomes a force multiplier for the smaller side. Third, the small force exploits a single, often counterintuitive, tactical edge. It's not about matching the giant's strength, it's about finding that one lever that can topple it. Whether it's empty fortresses and a scorched earth policy, the fluid adaptability of Roman maniples, or the brutal effectiveness of landslides and halberds, these tactical innovations shatter the giant's perceived invincibility. It's not about fighting fair, it's about fighting smart, using surprise and ingenuity to turn the tables. Empires, with their vastness and complexity, often forget a crucial truth: every mile they advance into a smaller kingdom is a mile supplied by wagons that can be burned, bridges that can be chopped down, and supply lines that can be stretched to a breaking point. Their strength, their very size, becomes their greatest vulnerability. If these stories flip the way you think about power, if they make you question the conventional wisdom, then you absolutely have to hit that subscribe button. Because next week, we're breaking down how a 300-ship fleet of islanders once managed to completely strangle the trade of a continent-spanning caliphate. You won't want to miss it. Section 5, the takeaway for today. So, what does this ancient history tell us about today? Size still matters, of course, but only if you can feed it. The British Empire once ruled a quarter of the planet, a truly staggering achievement, yet it ultimately lost the American colonies. Why? Because those colonists, despite being outmatched in conventional warfare, knew their land, could melt back into the population, and understood that disrupting British supply lines, stretching thousands of miles across an ocean, was their real weapon. The logistical nightmare of maintaining order and supply across such vast distances proved insurmountable. Or consider the Mongol Empire, an unprecedented feat of conquest that spanned from Korea to Poland. But for all its military genius, it fractured in just 4 generations. Not only due to internal squabbles, but because even their legendary speed couldn't overcome the sheer distances and the primitive communication of the era. A message could take weeks or months to travel, making unified command over such a vast expanse nearly impossible, leaving local leaders to fend for themselves or carve out their own destinies. The empire became too big to effectively govern itself. Meanwhile, little states, or even small, innovative entities in the modern world, survive and thrive by turning perceived weakness into speed and agility. Think about it: decisions in days, not months of parliamentary debate or corporate bureaucracy. Armies that can melt back into villages, meaning they're not tied down by massive, expensive infrastructure or rigid hierarchies. And every victory, every clever maneuver, gets amplified, generating immense PR value that makes the lumbering giant look ridiculous and out of touch. This isn't just ancient history, It's a blueprint for today's startups challenging established corporations, or nimble guerrilla forces facing conventional armies. Remember, empires need flawless, uninterrupted supply lines. Kingdoms, or any smaller, agile entity, just need one good choke point and a few angry locals who know every single rock and shadow of their home turf. To sum it up, history's scoreboard shows us a consistent truth: the bigger the empire, the harder it trips over its own supply wagons, its own logistical overstretch, and its own hubris. Whether it's Die Viet emptying granaries and setting a brilliant ambush, Roman maniples slicing through the rigid formations of the phalanx, or Swiss shepherds dropping boulders on armored knights, the lesson is identical: scale might buy you land and impressive statistics, but brains buy you time, tactical advantage through terrain, and the kind of terror that can shatter an empire's will. Next time someone claims size equals destiny, or that the biggest player always wins, tell them the story of Chilang Pass. Tell them how a million-man empire learned, the hard way, that a narrow trail and a quiet, determined peasant army can rewrite the map faster and more decisively than any decree from the Forbidden City. It's a timeless lesson in the enduring power of ingenuity over sheer mass.